We've seen a couple of simple troubleshooting techniques and things like using nslog to send messages to the console. But sometimes it's not quite so clear where the problem is, and you don't want to start writing dozens or even hundreds of nslog messages all through your code, because sometimes what you really want to do is step through your code line by line as it executes. And we're going to do that by using the Xcode debugger. Now, technically what Xcode is using under the hood is the GNU debugger, or GDB. This is a debugging tool that's been being developed since the mid-80s. It's very robust and very common on Unix platforms. And to do this, I'm using a simple iPhone view-based application. It's available in Chapter 6 exercise files. It's called Breakpoint Starter. But it's actually very simple. If I were to look at the nib file, I can see that what I've got is a button conveniently titled Boom and a blank label. What that button is doing is calling some very straightforward code here in a method called doSomething. It creates a couple of integers, divides one by the other, uses the result to create a string, and then uses that string to set the contents of a label. So some fairly simple stuff there. And in fact, this code is syntactically correct. It will compile. I can prove that by hitting Command B, and I can see down at the bottom it says build succeeded. But I know that it isn't going to work, and I'm going to run this. I'm going to click Build and Go to run it, and we're actually going to be running using what's called the debug configuration, which supports attaching to the debugger. I know that we're using that mode because that's the default mode for all Xcode projects. If I look at the top left of the Xcode window, I can see a drop-down box there that says Simulator-3.0 Debug. Now this is allowing us to choose between running on the simulator or the device, and allowing us to choose between running in a debug configuration or a release configuration. Debug is the default, and all that really means is it introduces symbols into your code to allow the debugger to hook into it. One of the things that happens then when we run in that mode is that Xcode itself changes, and the gray bar between our list of files and the file that we're actively working on changes and adds several buttons in it, including this one looking like a can of bug spray, and this one looking like a console with the words GDB in it. We'll explore those in a second, but those are there because we're running the program right now. If I wasn't running the program, those icons would disappear. I'm going to click the Boom button and see what happens. Well, it's kind of non-obvious. We actually got kicked back into our code, but it didn't throw up any kind of dialog box or message box or sheet saying there was a problem. It's just jumped back into the code here. Well, there actually is a problem, but we've got to figure out what it is. I can see with this red arrow over here on line 19 that we're positioned on the line that says int result equals a divided by b. Now, I might think that this is just fine, but I'm being kind of given the clue by the fact that it's jumped here that there is a problem with it. It hasn't said what. What I can do is choose to execute this line by coming up here to this little button that looks like a VCR play button. It says continue execution. And if I do that, and what will happen is down at the bottom left, I will see a new status bar that says GDB, program received signal, exe_arithmetic, or some other message, depending on what's gone wrong. I could also see that by clicking on this console button, where it pops up some of the messages that are being output by the GDB debugger. Now, what is giving me the clue here is this exe_arithmetic says, hey, there's an arithmetic problem here. I might still be puzzled and wonder what that is, but I can find out a bit better if I go back to my code. I'm going to mouse over the different variables that are being divided. I mouse over A and it says it's an integer, A, and it's 100. I mouse over B and it says it's an integer, B, and it's 0. And I can think, okay, well, you can't do that. You can't do a divide by 0 on a computing system. That's a problem. So I can either re-examine some of this code, or I can go, well, what would happen if that wasn't a 0? Well, luckily I can check it out. I can mouse over here and single click on the 0, and I'm going to change it to 5 and then hit return. So now when I mouse over A, it says 100 and B says 5. What I'm going to do is say, yes, I actually want to continue to execute this. And I'm going to hit that continue button, which either means go to the end of the program or next time there's some kind of built-in pause. I hit that. And now that status bar down here changes to GDB running. If I were to click back over to the iPhone simulator, I can see that I've actually got a result out. Yep, result is 20. 100 divided by 5 is 20. Looks pretty good. But of course, What I can't do is rely on that happening all the time. So I'm going to quit out of the simulator and talk about how we might start to figure out what's exactly going wrong. Let's imagine that this code is a bit more complex than it really is. Now, obviously, what's happening is on line 17, when I call the method to set the value of b, it's not returning anything useful. So what I'm going to do is hover my mouse over the gutter, that gray bar beside the line numbers if you have line numbering on, and I'm going to click in there, and it adds a bright blue arrow. This is a breakpoint. You're telling the debugger, when you hit this line of code, stop. Now, if I click here, I get a bright blue icon. If I click again, it becomes somewhat dimmer, which means it's not active anymore. You can kind of flip them on and off. But if I wanted to get rid of it entirely, I'd actually click it and drag it off to the left till my mouse turns to a little cloud and then let go. But I do want to have it there, so I'm going to highlight that. And then I'm going to click Build and Go. It won't have hit that breakpoint yet because I haven't clicked the button. I click the button, and it immediately says, okay, I'm going to hit that breakpoint. I have paused at that particular position. Now we're stopped at this breakpoint. If you notice down at the bottom left, it says GDB, stopped at breakpoint 1, hit count 1. We're in the do something method on line 17. Looks good. If I hover over integer a, I can see that's equal to 100. It looks okay. But we shouldn't have set integer b right now. Any value in there is just in the fact that it's kind of garbage and hasn't really been set. What I can do here is go, okay, I know that this was doing something wrong, so I want to see what's happening in this method calculate second value. So to do that, instead of continuing, I'm going to jump into the calculate second value method. And the way that I do that is by using the button that says step into method or function call. The choices that I have here are to continue, which means just keep going till you either hit another breakpoint or the program does what it does. I have step over method or function call. Now that doesn't mean skip it, but it means execute it. But if I'm executing by calling another method, I don't want to jump into that method. I just want to execute the method and run this line of code and move on to the next line. But what I want to do is step into that. So I'm going to click the step into method or function call, which is the arrow pointing down toward the dot. I click that one, and you can see that my red arrow has jumped into the calculate second value method on line 10. I'm now positioned at line 12. We can imagine there's lots of complex code here. And I'm going to say, okay, return 0. I'm going to step forward again. It's going to hit the end of that and then return. So we're going to jump across to line 19. Now, B should be set. And I can say, that's where B was getting the value of 0. Okay, now I understand. Line 12 is the one that's completely wrong. So I could just stop right now. I could click the big octagonal red button to stop this program and say, okay, I don't need that breakpoint anymore. I'm going to drag it off to the side. I'm going to say, this is not meant to be returning 0. It's returning 5. Change that. Click Build and Go again. Yes, I want to save my changes. Jump into here and boom, seems to be doing result is 20. We're not jumping into the debugger. It's setting itself correctly. So that's very simple debugging, setting a breakpoint, stepping through your code and examining some of the values underneath.